Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us today for the fourth iteration of Suburban Diagnostics' Knowledge Spree series of webinars, where today the thrust of the session is to provide therapeutic insights into the management of COVID-19. We have two very eminent speakers today who will be expounding on two core areas, pharmacotherapies in COVID-19 and the medical management of COVID-19. My name is Dr. Vineet Nair, and I will be your moderator for today's event. I would like to remind everyone that our webinars are intended to be as interactive as possible, and we encourage you to actively participate by submitting as many questions as you like at any time you want during the presentation. To submit your question, simply type the question into the chat box to your right and click send. We will have a consolidated Q&A session with both speakers towards the end of the presentation. If you have any trouble seeing or hearing the presentation, please use the chat box to let us know that you're experiencing a problem. Please note, with this webinar, we will be giving certificates of attendance. All those who complete the webinars and wish to be provided with the certificate must fill a form which we will provide to you at the end of the webinars. This form only asks for your email as well as your name and title as you wish to appear on the certificate. Only those who fill out the form will be provided the certificate. I would now like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Jagdeep Gupte, the Global Chief Medical Officer and Head of Medical Services at Cipla. Dr. Gupte completed his MBBS from Grant Medical College and MD in Pharmacology from St. GS Medical College and KEM Hospital. He has been with Cipla, one of India's largest pharmaceutical companies since 1994, and is currently their Global Chief Medical Officer. With an extensive background in research in various therapeutic fields, he has 40 publications and over 50 presentations at the national and international conferences. With a stellar background and years of expertise to draw upon, Dr. Gupte is the ideal speaker to expound on the pharmacotherapies in COVID-19. Without further ado, let me hand over the reins of this webinar to Dr. Gupte. Over to you, sir.
So thank you very much, Vineet, and thank you to Suburban Diagnostics for their kind invitation to speak here. This is obviously an extremely important topic today, a challenging one because the things are moving so fast. So in the next 15 or 20 minutes, I'll try to give you an overview of what is actually happening as far as developing pharmacotherapies in COVID-19 are concerned. So that's the title of my topic of pharmacotherapies in COVID-19. And the first slide here is actually showing you life cycle of the SARS-CoV-2 virus in host cells as it enters the respiratory tract. And I think all of you by now know that the virus is an RNA virus, which enters through the respiratory tract, binds to the ACE2 receptor, enters into the cell, then opens up, allows its RNA to go into the host cell, gets translated, replicated, forms small virus particles, and eventually releases new virus particles to infect other cells. And this happens quite rapidly. So this is a very typical, a very simplistic way of looking at how the life cycle of SARS-CoV-2 virus is in the cells. Let me move to the next slide, and I don't want to make it very complicated for us. But this slide shows you a little more deep inside the cell what happens and where drugs can be developed to target the various sites. So for example, you can try and prevent entry of the virus into the cell itself. Second, you can try and block the effect of the virus within the endoplasmic reticulum and release with certain drugs. You can inhibit certain enzymes like polymerases or protease kind of enzymes, which the virus uses for replication. And maybe you can even block the release of the virus particles from the cells. So these kinds of drugs are there, act at various viral infections, and you can develop drugs targeted at each of these sites. The other kinds of drugs that are used in viral infections, and particularly in COVID-19, is drugs that target the inflammatory cascade that occurs in COVID-19. We all know that all viral infections have inflammation. We don't always use very potent anti-inflammatory agents. We generally use either a paracetamol or at the most some NSAIDs. But here specifically is something that I would like to share with you of using extremely potent injectable anti-inflammatories as we go along. So this is a brief to give you of how the virus replicates. where in different parts of the cell where the virus is replicating, we can use drugs to target this. For example, hydroxychloroquine, or some of the antivirals that you may have heard of, or some of the new drugs that are coming up. Now, this is also important to look at because this is typically what a patient goes through when we'll touch more on this from the medical management point of view. But I just want to show you here that on the left side, you can see there is an incubation period once the person is exposed to a virus, which is about 4 to 5 days. At the end of 5 days, on an average, the person develops symptoms like fever, cough, fatigue, anorexia, etc. And then in majority of cases, 80%, it's mild to moderate and the patient goes home or improves or becomes all right just with supportive treatment. In about 15 to 20% of patients, the disease may become a little more severe. Patient becomes breathless, may have low oxygenation, and may even develop critical illness, which may require intensive care administration, intensive care unit admission, and or the need for a ventilator. Now, this is the overall clinical picture of COVID-19, and where can we intervene with drugs? For example, we could use prophylaxis. That means prevent the virus from entering into the respiratory cells in the first place. So that's prophylaxis treatment. We could treat using antiviral drugs. And I think if we are using antivirals, we should be using in the first 7 to 8 days. This is a time when the virus is replicating very rapidly. And in those patients who develop more severe illness, who are admitted to the hospital, in addition to antivirals, we may have to consider anti-inflammatory or immunomodulatory drugs, because in some patients, there is an overactive immune system that occurs, and this leads to severe lung injury, ARDS, and probably that is the reason for death with maybe 1 or 2 other causes. So somewhere along these lines, if you want to treat the virus and its inflammation, we may have to use antivirals and somewhere in a smaller proportion of patients, immunomodulatory drugs. So what are the various drugs that are under study for COVID-19? So I have to first of all say that this is a disclaimer from me. Till now, there is no formally approved treatment by any regulatory agency for COVID-19. Most of the drugs that we are using have actually been developed for some other infection or other disease, and we are repurposing them for the treatment of COVID-19. So for example, you may have heard of remdesivir. A lot of it in the news. So remdesivir was originally a drug developed for the treatment of Ebola virus. And you may recall the Ebola virus epidemic, which happened in Africa. This has now got what they call emergency use authorization in the US and Japan, and is under such review in Europe. You may have heard of this antiretroviral drug, which has been used for HIV for years, called lopinavir ritonavir. People are trying to use that in COVID-19, and I'll talk about that. Then there are some other anti-influenza antiviral drugs. Arbidol, which is a drug out of Russia. Favipiravir, which is originally a Japanese drug available for flu for many years, but has been repurposed for this. Antimalarials, which you are more familiar with, hydroxychloroquine or chloroquine. Anti-hepatitis C or drugs used for SARS, like ribavirin, has been tried. Interferons, which have been used a lot in the past for various viral infections. So there is a large bunch of antiviral drugs which are being tested in COVID-19. Other than that is immunomodulating drugs, and I will talk about anti-inflammatories later. Corticosteroids could be used. Tocilizumab, which is an IL-6 inhibitor, could be used. Eculizumab, and many others are there. So I won't go into much details right now, but let me come back to this later. So let's briefly talk on few of the drugs that we are familiar with. Hydroxychloroquine, which has been in the news, which is being recommended by certain governments for use. What's the data on hydroxychloroquine? Now, this particular graph that you see is from where the excitement of hydroxychloroquine started. So this was a French study, a very small study of about 36 patients, in which what these researchers did is in 16 patients who got no hydroxychloroquine or no azithromycin, the virus did not clear for more than 6 days. But those who got hydroxychloroquine, the blue bar, the blue line shows you the virus cleared faster. And those who got hydroxychloroquine plus azithromycin, all 6 patients who got this combination, the virus cleared in a matter of 5 or 6 days. So this looked very, very interesting that the virus could clear so fast in patients who took hydroxychloroquine or the combination. And therefore, there was a lot of excitement with this research. But one, we must be careful of actually the study because this was an uncontrolled kind of study. This was not a randomized study. And some patients who were not analyzed actually went into the ICU or died. And therefore, there has been a lot of criticism of this kind of study. And in fact, the society which allowed the publication of this study into their journal actually made a comment that this does not go with the standards of their society. So I think there is a lot of controversy on this particular study, but I have to say, this is the study that set off the excitement on the use of hydroxychloroquine. 2 or 3 days ago, 2 studies have now been published in the British Medical Journal on the use of hydroxychloroquine, and I'm not going to make it very complicated. One study is on the use of hydroxychloroquine in hospitalized patients with COVID-19 pneumonia who require oxygen. And in these patients, unfortunately, there was no evidence to show that hydroxychloroquine was effective in reducing mortality or improving discharge or reducing the requirement of oxygen. Unfortunately, it was negative. The second study from China in the same journal also published the use of hydroxychloroquine in hospitalized patients with mainly mild to moderate disease. And even in these patients, there was no improvement by use of hydroxychloroquine. Both studies, unfortunately, failed to demonstrate the effect of the drug in the treatment of COVID-19. I certainly think that one of the issues in many of these studies is that the treatment with these drugs started too late. Most of these drugs have been initiated after 12 or 13 days of symptoms. And I think if you want to look at antiviral effects, it's too late to start this. But even if you consider the anti-inflammatory effects of hydroxychloroquine, they did not seem to be really evident in either of these 2 studies. So therefore, at this point, the data on the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine in the treatment of COVID-19 pneumonia seems to be conflicting. And while people are recommending it because we have no other option, I think the data is still conflicting, and one cannot say for sure that the drug actually works. People are also using hydroxychloroquine as a prophylaxis. And why did this happen? So this is actually an interesting publication from a journal called Clinical Infectious Disease, where some of the laboratory work done in a Petri dish showed that hydroxychloroquine prevented the entry of the virus into the cells. And therefore, people thought, can we use this as a prophylaxis? Now, this is a lot of laboratory and Petri dish studies. But if you actually look at clinical evidence, and you can see on the right, the whole review that has been done by a few authors. And this actually review has a very nice review come from Jipmer and Pondicherry by Indian authors. And they concluded saying that although preclinical results are promising, to date, there is a dearth of evidence to support the efficacy of either chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine in preventing COVID-19. And we all know some of the safety related issues of these drugs. So therefore, they recommended that it must be evaluated in high quality clinical trials before a recommendation is actually made for the use of prophylaxis. So again, good laboratory data, but we still lack adequate clinical trials or clinical data on the use of hydroxychloroquine, both as treatment and as prophylaxis. Let's come to a more interesting drug, lopinavir ritonavir, an anti-HIV drug which has been available for more than 10 years. And this was the largest study that is now available till date, called as the LOTUS study, which was done in China. This was a very well-conducted study, randomized, controlled, open-label trial. And they took patients with more severe disease, where their oxygen saturation was less than 94%. 100 patients received only standard treatment. 99 patients received lopinavir ritonavir plus standard of care for about 2 weeks. And if you look at the results of this study, they were trying to see if there is a time to clinical improvement. But in this, there was no difference in time to clinical improvement. So people said that the study has failed. But if you look carefully at some of the subgroup analysis, if you started treatment early, within 12 days, they said, then the time to clinical improvement was actually shorter by only 1 or 2 days. It wasn't too long, but there seemed to be some difference in the time to clinical improvement. On the next slide, I'd like to show you some of the secondary outcomes or other parameters that were measured. Very interestingly, mortality at the end of 4 weeks was numerically lower in those who took the drug versus those in the standard of care. 19% versus 25%. And if you did a what is called as a modified statistical calculation, which I can tell you is done by statisticians, it may actually suggest that the drug was effective, and the difference actually was 16% mortality versus 25%. Very interestingly, the time spent in ICU was 6 days in the drug treatment group versus 11 days in those who did not receive the drug. And the proportion of patients with clinical improvement was higher, about 45% versus 30% at day 14. There were, of course, side effects with the drug. Lopinavir, ritonavir is known to cause significant GI side effects and occasionally some skin eruptions. Now, overall, what the conclusion of the study was that this study was actually non-conclusive to say whether the drug works or does not work. And you need a larger sample size to actually look at the efficacy of this drug. And this drug is now being studied in a very large clinical trial by the World Health Organization of more than 1,500 patients. So we will know soon enough whether this drug works or not. So this was the summary, and therefore let me not spend time on this. And I'll come to the next one. So this is another drug which has just started clinical trials in India. Two companies have started trials. It's called Favipiravir. It's a prodrug which gets converted into its metabolite, the triphosphate metabolite, inside the cell and blocks viral application. Well, the drug regulatory body in China had said that they will approve the use of this drug for COVID-19. So that's the only country right now which has given some kind of approval for the use of this drug in COVID-19. And this was based on this study which compared Favipiravir with Lopinavir, ritonavir. The dose of Favipiravir was quite high. It's a 200 milligram tablet, 1600 milligrams twice daily on day 1, and then 600 milligrams twice daily from days 2 to 14. And again, they looked at what is the number of how long it took to clear the virus from the body. Now, importantly, in addition to this drug, all patients also were given interferon injection, not injection in the study, by aerosol inhalation. And what were the results? The median time to viral clearance was 4 days for Favipiravir versus 11 days for those who took Lopinavir, ritonavir. So there seemed to be a quicker viral clearance with Favipiravir than with the earlier drugs. And I think this is what is intriguing, because this is for the first time suggesting that the use of this compound could actually clear the virus faster from the body. Then a more interesting compound which is now being investigated is remdesivir. This is an injectable antiviral drug that has just received emergency use authorization for the treatment of COVID-19 in the US and Japan. And the way it is given is, it is given 200 milligrams on day 1, followed by 100 milligrams from day 2 for 5 or 10 days, depending on the disease in the patient. And there is only one published study till now. The rest are more or less press releases, which have given the data. In general, it has been suggested that patients who receive remdesivir, especially early on, seem to have improved clinical outcomes as compared to those who received the drug late or did not receive the drugs. And you can see in the bottom part, a study called as the adaptive treatment trial. Patients who received remdesivir had a 30% faster time to clinical recovery of 11 days versus 15 days, those who did not get the drug. And there was a possible survival benefit, 8% mortality versus 11.6% mortality. So perhaps there is some benefit with the use of this compound. But I have to tell you, the data of these studies are not yet fully published. And this is a study on remdesivir from China, which is showing you again things like time to clinical improvement. And you can see 21 days versus 23 days. So a very small difference in the efficacy of remdesivir. So I think what overall it is suggesting that these drugs have a modest effect, but it is, I think, important to know when they're actually started in treatment. If you start them too late, perhaps it is actually too late to see an effect. And finally, the last 2-3 slides I want to cover is a very fascinating paper that came last Saturday, I think, on combination treatment for COVID-19. And this reminded me of my early days in Cipla, nearly 20 years ago, where we did a lot of work in HIV, where all of you now know HIV is treated by 3 drugs. So this is a combination of 3 drugs for the treatment of COVID-19. Lopinavir, ritonavir, ribavirin, which some of you may recall was a drug used for hepatitis C and for some of the SARS infection and respiratory infections in the past, and interferon versus monotherapy with lopinavir. And what they were able to demonstrate at the bottom, you can see in the table, that the time to a negative viral swab in the nasopharynx was 6.5 days in the 3-drug combination versus 12.5 days. So a very, very significant reduction in the time to eradicating the virus from the nasal swab. The duration of hospital stay was also significantly reduced from 15 days to 8 days. But again, let me point out, this effect was seen only when the treatment was started in less than 7 days of symptom onset. If the treatment was started later, after 7 days, the difference between the drug treatment group and the no treatment group actually became much smaller, and the effect of the 3 drugs virtually had disappeared. So again, I want to stress, when we are going to be looking at using drugs as they come, the idea is to seriously look at using them drugs early on in order to see clinical benefit. And finally, a couple of words on the immunomodulators. Tocilizumab is a monoclonal antibody essentially used for the treatment of rheumatoid arthritis. It is an interleukin-6 inhibitor and reduces the inflammatory response that we see in some of these autoimmune diseases. So this is actually a very small report that has appeared of 21 patients who in China were treated with tocilizumab, and these patients had severe disease. As you can see, 4 of them were critically ill, 2 needed invasive ventilation, 1 had NIV, all needed oxygen at rest with high flow oxygen, nasal or mask. And you can see that on the figure A is the levels of C-reactive protein, which is an inflammatory marker, and in the B graph is actually fever. And you can see within 1 day, 24 hours after giving tocilizumab to these patients, the C-reactive protein came dramatically down in all 21 patients, except 1, which came down on day 3. And fever had virtually reduced to normal in 24 hours after giving tocilizumab. Now, by blocking interleukin-6, it is believed that tocilizumab may reduce the inflammatory overactivity that is seen in patients with COVID-19. And this is called as CRS, cytokine release storm, which occurs in a certain proportion of patients with COVID-19. It's difficult to say which patients develop this syndrome, but perhaps those who are older, those who have certain chronic diseases, see this kind of a storm, and therefore people are seriously considering using this drug. In fact, a very large clinical trial is going on worldwide to see the effect of tocilizumab, and in India as well, I know that a clinical trial will soon be starting to look at the effect of tocilizumab in patients who are severely ill. So let me summarize by what I have just spoken. Number 1, as we go along, we are learning that for antivirals, starting treatment early probably better than late. So the idea is to have a quick diagnosis, which I know can sometimes be challenging because the test takes time to report. Perhaps starting within 7 days, maybe 5 days is even better. Patients with mild symptoms may just need supportive treatment, and I'm sure Dr. Tanu will speak on that. The real people to look at is those with moderate to severe disease and those who are at risk of severe disease. So we are also seeing youngsters who sometimes develop severe disease. Are we able to identify those at risk for severe disease? And therefore, even if they have mild symptoms, should we treat them with antivirals? These are all questions which have yet to be answered. And of course, in those with lung injury or ARDS, consider the role of immunomodulators is being investigated. See, on the right side, I'm just showing you a list of the drugs. Favipiravir, clinical trials are starting in India, and remdesivir are the 2 promising antivirals at the moment. Lopinavir, ritonavir, inconclusive, could be effective, we don't know. Hydroxychloroquine, conflicting data. Azithromycin is an antibiotic, question mark, unless it is used in combination with hydroxychloroquine. I think combination therapy with one or more drugs will probably be required for the treatment of COVID-19. There is a very large study started by WHO called as the Solidarity Study, which is including 1,500 patients who receive standard of care and then 1,500 patients with different drugs. In one 1,500 patient group, they're giving hydroxychloroquine. Another, they're going to give lopinavir, ritonavir. In another, remdesivir. And this study has also come to India. 4 or 5 hospitals in India will now be participating in this global study by WHO called as the Solidarity Study. And finally, let me add, as people all over the world are searching for drugs for COVID-19, there are nearly 60 or 70 drugs which have been found to have antiviral effects. Other commonly used drugs like ivermectin, doxycycline, cyclesonide, which is an inhaler, and nitazoxanide, which some of you may be familiar with, are all being tested for the treatment of COVID-19. So I'm going to stop here, my friends. Thank you all very much for a patient hearing. And I hope I've been able to give an overview of what's happening as far as pharmacotherapy in COVID-19 is concerned. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, sir, for that crisp and clear presentation. Let me remind the audience that we'll be answering your questions for both sessions together at the end. For those attendees who came in late, let me reiterate, this webinar will be provided with, those who are attending this webinar will be given certificates of attendance. All those who require this web certificate must fill a form which we will provide to you at the end of the session. Let me now introduce our second speaker, Dr. Tanu Singhal, consultant in pediatrics and infectious diseases at Kokilaben Dhirubhai Ambani Hospital and Medical Research Institute. Dr. Singhal trained in pediatrics at AIIMS, New Delhi, and in infectious diseases and international health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She has been associated with Kokilaben Hospital since its inception as a consultant in pediatrics and infectious disease. She is an advisor to the ICMR on antimicrobial stewardship and a technical expert in pediatric tuberculosis for the National Tuberculosis Control and Elimination Program. Dr. Singhal has many reputed awards and publications to her credit. With her rich clinical background and recent experience of treating COVID patients, Dr. Singhal will now be sharing her expertise in a practical, case-based format. Over to you, Dr. Singhal.
Thank you, Vineet. And I'm going to, after that excellent presentation by Dr. Gogte, I'm going to talk about a few cases that we have been seeing in the past 6 weeks since we've been managing COVID-19. So before we go to management, we need to understand some basic principles which will actually determine how we handle patients. The first thing is that the diagnostic tests have limited sensitivity, so you may have a person with a COVID-like illness where the swab may be negative, and these patients, you will have to manage them properly because we know that the sensitivity of the swab is only 50 to 70%. The other thing is that you will have patients coming in with other illnesses who are being swabbed now as part of routine clinical care, and they will be swab positive. And what you're detecting in the throat may have no causal association with the patient's clinical manifestations. So you have to remember that. Now, the other thing is that overall, it's most of the people actually recover. That's a very important message that I need to give. But about 15 to 20% of patients have severe disease, and some of them may need even critical care, and 1 to 3% of people may actually die. And we also know now very nicely that what are the groups that are at risk for severe disease, especially those who are elderly and especially those who have various kinds of comorbidities. And we clearly see that association in our clinical practice where people who are in their 20s or 30s usually have an uneventful recovery, whereas those who are above 40 take some time to recover, and those who are above 60 to 70 may go into the ARDS phenomena. The other thing which is important to understand is that it is a disease where deterioration usually occurs after day 7, day 8. Therefore, when you have a patient, you need to intervene early for sure, but you can't let go of your guard till 10 days have elapsed, because some people may appear well to begin with and may start deteriorating after 6 to 7 days. The other thing is that we know now that there are clinical and lab markers which can predict severity. So you know that if your patient is elderly or has other comorbidities, they are likely to have a severe illness. And you also know now that there are certain lab markers like the absolute lymphocyte count, the C-reactive protein, the CPK, LDH, D dimers, which if they are very elevated can predict that your patient may have a severe outcome. The other thing which is very important about the management of this disease is, apart from management of the patient, you have to manage the family members and the healthcare workers who have been in contact with this patient. And this is the single biggest challenge in these patients, because most of the times, you think about yourself first as a healthcare worker, then about the patient, and the entire family is also extremely anxious and all the time worried about themselves apart from the patient. And you need to work on the psyche of the patient and the family and the social stigma which comes with being COVID positive. And also the fact that many people who come into the hospital may actually not be able to see their family at all. If they go downhill, they may go on a ventilator into the ICU and then pass away, and they'll have nobody close with them. And that, I think, gives me the uh, goosebumps that, this is really a frightening scenario. So let us talk about two cases which tell us how we manage these patients in today's era, where we have limited drugs for treatment. So this is, let me say, about a patient who's a 23-year-old healthy male with a BMI of 26. Why am I speaking about the BMI? Because obesity has emerged as an important risk factor in patients with COVID. So if you have an obese person, you really watch that person very carefully, because like the elderly, he may also deteriorate. So of course, this patient has a reasonable BMI, and he has fever going on for a couple of days along with sore throat. And he tests positive for COVID, because nowadays everybody is aware, and many of them who will go and get themselves tested. And by the time the patient's test report comes, the fever is actually declining. So the question which your treating physician faces in this setting is that, first is, where should this patient be managed? What lab investigations should be done? Are there any specific drugs which need to be given to this patient, and what monitoring does this patient require? So let us answer these things one by one. So basically, this is a patient who has no comorbidities. He has a mild illness. And if this person actually has a house where he can isolate himself from his family with an attached toilet, it would be good to manage a person like this at home, because you obviously want to keep the COVID center beds, etc., for people who need this or who cannot isolate them effectively in their house. As far as lab investigations are concerned, if this patient's fever is already declining and he's afebrile, like many young people are by day 2, day 3, when the reports come, really one would not want to do any major tests here. What about any specific drugs? And here again, as we discussed earlier, that, drugs actually are questionable. And this is the kind of patient where you would probably just offer symptomatic care, because he's already recovering and there are no real risk factors for this patient to progress to severe disease. So basically, in this patient, the fever resolved by the time the test results came in. He was treated at home. No specific drugs were given other than paracetamol, which also he didn't need. And then the biggest question which comes here is that, when can he be de-isolated? So this is something very important which we must need to understand, because that has changed over time. See, earlier it was believed that people are infectious till they keep shedding the virus in their throat, and nasopharyngeal swabs for RNA would come positive for even up to a month after infection. And earlier guidelines from China, etc., said that you can only de-isolate people once 2 successive nasopharyngeal swabs are negative. But subsequently, there is more and more data that for COVID-19, the infectivity is maximum in the first week, especially at the time of onset of symptoms or a day or two before that. And after a week, if the patient has clinically recovered, then the virus is no longer culturable from the throat, even though the RNA test comes positive. And therefore, the current guidelines which have been issued by the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare and the ICMR say that for people who have clinically recovered and who are otherwise stable, 10 days from the time of onset of symptoms is the time when they can be actually discharged. and they can discontinue isolation 17 days from the onset of symptoms, and repeat testing is actually not needed. And that is, I think, what we will probably have to do now, because so many people are turning positive, that if you start spending resources on proving negativity, then it will actually take up a lot of resources and even hospital beds. Now, let us come to two other issues which are there in the management of this patient. So, the biggest question now from the patient is, I have recovered, but I have family contacts. That means I have two elderly parents and one sister living in the same house. So, what should be done about them? Now, one must understand that by the time a person makes the diagnosis of COVID, or the diagnosis of COVID is made, most of the transmission to the family has already occurred. Because, as I said, the infectivity is maximum in the first week and at the time of onset of symptoms. So, there is a possibility that the patient could have transmitted the virus even before he or she isolated himself. So it is good to monitor these people clinically. And if they get symptoms, then you test them. But I must also say at this point in time that if somebody has a COVID patient in the house, and there are two other people living in the same house, and they start running fever and sore throat, actually you may do a test, but in all probability, you can assume that they too have COVID, because at this point in time, especially in Mumbai, where there's so many infections happening, most people who are presenting with an influenza-like illness are actually COVID positive, and especially more so if they have a family member who's COVID positive. So the guidelines say that, all asymptomatic contacts, you need to test them once 5 to 10 days after exposure. But sometimes this is not possible, because as the number of people who get infected increase, then the number of contacts will also increase, and doing tests on them may be actually difficult. And you must understand that a negative test does not rule out infection, because only 50% test positive. And suppose you've done the test on day 5 and the person actually starts shedding the virus on day 10, because the incubation period can be anywhere up to 14 days, you may make a false negative diagnosis. The ICMR also recommends that household contacts can be given HCQ prophylaxis, which is given 400 milligram twice a day for the first week, and then every week for 3 weeks. But again, as Dr. Gogte said earlier, we don't really know what is the efficacy of the HCQ prophylaxis, and also whether it can be given safely to elderly people who may already be having cardiac problems. And they are the people who actually need it most, because they are the ones who, if they catch COVID, are likely to have a bad outcome. The other big question which we face in our day-to-day setting is that usually we have doctors calling up that, I examined this patient briefly in the OPD. He came to me with this fever and cough, and then I examined it. Now I've come to know that he's COVID positive. So what should I do? And so this is also, one must understand that now all doctors should try to follow all practices of PPE, because many of the patients that they will be seeing in the OPD may be COVID positive. So they always have to keep their masks on. They have to ensure that the patient always puts the mask on, and they use hand hygiene after every patient, and they keep the duration of the consult short. Because we know that a close contact is one when both the patient and the exposed have spent more than 15 minutes in the same room, face to face, etc. So that means if you are basically seeing the patient, you could do a quick examination, then ask the patient to wait outside, and then maybe write down your prescription and give it to him, and try and use telemedicine as much as possible. But in this particular case, when the doctor just saw the patient for a short while and both of them were wearing masks, I don't think there was any real risk of transmission to the doctor. And we must reassure people that, about this. So I think this is how I have discussed one case, which most of the cases of COVID-19 are likely to be in the current scenario. And let us move to a slightly more complicated case. Now, this is another case which came to us when we started our COVID unit. A 56-year-old physician who only has mild hypertension as the comorbidity, who is on angiotensin receptor blocker. He has fever with sore throat since 6 days, and he starts hydroxychloroquine on his own on day 3 of illness. And because he feels that it could be COVID, because COVID cases had just started coming in at that time. And day 6, he tests COVID positive. Now, this patient on day 6 has fever of 102. He has no breathlessness, however. Saturation is 97% on room air. So now again, the same question arises in this patient. That first, where should the patient be treated? What labs, if any, need to be done? What drugs would you start here? And how would you monitor the patient? Because this is different from the first case that I talked about. So there is no question that a person like this has to be admitted to a hospital because one, he is above the age of 50. Two, he has a comorbidity. And three, he is not recovering by day 5, day 6. Day 6 also he's running high fever. So this is a kind of patient who can actually progress from to moderate to severe disease. And that is the entire reason why the government recommends that people who have comorbidities should get admitted to hospital when they are diagnosed with COVID, so they can be carefully monitored and intervention done when needed. Now, the next question is, what labs would you do? So in this patient, you would be more liberal with the labs. And, you would want to actually know how much is what are the severity indicators. And I will discuss them one by one. So in this patient, his white cell count was 6,700, which is normal. But if you look at the absolute lymphocyte count, it was 1,200. It is believed that an absolute lymphocyte count of less than 1,000 is a poor prognostic marker, or it indicates severity of disease. The platelets were not very low, and that has been our experience in the 100 or so patients that we've seen till now, that most people don't have low platelet counts, unlike many other viral diseases. In fact, we've had some patients with platelets as high as 5 lakhs, and that may be something to do with the severity of the or the inflammatory response. Now, his CRP was 210 milligram per liter, which obviously is very high, the cutoff being 6. The procalcitonin was normal, and that is something which we are seeing consistently in COVID patients, that though they have high fevers, they have high CRPs, but their procalcitonin is normal, and that actually tells you that you are unlikely dealing with a bacterial infection here. The liver enzymes were normal, and most of the people that we've seen with COVID don't have too much of liver dysfunction. D-dimer, it was elevated, and I think D-dimer is a very important test to send in patients with moderate to severe disease, because as you know, COVID-19 is a prothrombotic state, and high D-dimers actually indicate a prothrombotic state and are also a marker of severity of disease. CPK, LDH, and ferritin also have basically uh, uh, a kind of prognostic significance. And if you see high levels of these markers or rising levels, you know that a cytokine storm is setting in. And the chest X-ray was normal. So after all this, you know that you are probably dealing with a disease which is of moderate severity, and you really need to watch this patient carefully. Now, the next question comes is, how are you going to manage this patient? So let us talk about the treatment. Now, the first treatment, so these are the things which I'll be discussing. One is, what antipyretics should one use? What should we do about the ARVs? Is there a role of vitamin C, D, and zinc? What specific therapy we would like to give in this patient, because obviously something has to be given. What is the role of anticoagulants, and what is the role of antibiotics? Because this is a patient who has moderately severe disease, where definitely some more intervention is needed apart from just supportive care. Now, for as far as antibiotics in COVID-19 is concerned, paracetamol is the drug of choice. And if you remember, about a couple of months back, there was a lot of talk about ibuprofen worsening COVID-19 due to upregulation of ACE2 receptors, but now that has been discounted. But most people would like to avoid ibuprofen because it can cause gastritis and kidney injury, which is also common with COVID. Now, this is another raging controversy about ARBs and ACE inhibitors, because you know that COVID-19 enters through ACE receptors. People with hypertension or who are on these drugs have increase in these receptors, and therefore there was the hypothesis whether they have an increased risk of COVID-19. But now we have multiple studies which show no association between these drugs and either COVID-19 severity or death. And in fact, there's some who say that they may actually be protective. So it is very clear now that if a patient is actually on these drugs, there is no need to discontinue them if he develops COVID-19, and you can continue these drugs in them safely. And it would be actually bad to withdraw these drugs in such a patient and substitute it with another drug. As far as minerals and vitamins is concerned, a lot of it is doing the rounds. So as far as zinc is concerned, it is supposed to enhance the effect of HCQ, and there's some trials which are looking at HCQ and zinc therapy together, but there's no clinical data. As far as vitamin C is concerned, they said that there was some data about benefit in common cold. some of which is caused by coronavirus. And there are some studies which have shown that high dose IV vitamin C in the dose of 10 to 20 grams per day benefits ICU patients because it works as an antioxidant. And there is also a study in Chinese patients with IV vitamin C 12 grams per day, which showed some benefit. But again, there is no control data. So what people do by giving 500 milligram of vitamin C per day to a person with COVID actually is just works like a placebo. Then as far as vitamin D is concerned, vitamin D is supposed to be the panacea of everything. It kind of boosts the immune response. And they say that COVID-19 is more common in winter when vitamin D levels are low, and countries which were experiencing summer at this time, like Australia and all, had low COVID-19 cases. Is it related to vitamin D? I think it's okay to supplement, but you can't depend on it as doing something miraculous to these patients. And then we've already discussed about these specific drugs, so I'm not really going to come to them here. And as I said, that anticoagulation is important in COVID-19 because this is a prothrombotic state, and therefore all hospitalized patients with moderate disease should be given prophylactic anticoagulation with either enoxaparin or other other low molecular weight heparin preparations. And some people who have very severe disease with very high D dimers, etc., may need even therapeutic doses of anticoagulation. And all units have different policies. But in our hospital, we give low molecular weight heparin to all people with normal kidney function with moderate to severe COVID-19. As far as antibiotics are concerned, as I said, no role really of antibiotics because most people with COVID-19 don't have a coexistent bacterial infection, especially if their procalcitonin is normal. And therefore, even if you start antibiotics empirically in these patients, after you confirm the diagnosis, you stop the antibiotics. And in patients who deteriorate in the ICU, when they are having central lines and on a ventilator, that is the time when you must think that there could be a SIPO infection and escalate antibiotics. So in this patient, what we did was we basically gave the patient paracetamol, ceftriaxone, and hydroxychloroquine. He continued to have high fever. Day 9, his CRP went up, his ferritin went up, his lopinavir ritonavir was started, but then the QTC went up, so it was stopped. Fever touched 104. He started desaturating, and the oxygen started requiring oxygen, and the X-ray worsened. So obviously, this is a patient who has now gone into a cytokine storm. And at this point, like Dr. Gupte said, there is a role to consider anti-immunomodulators like tocilizumab, which is an anti-IL-6 drug, or steroids. And in this patient, we did start with tocilizumab because his IL-6 was high. We gave one dose and we gave a repeat dose, but his fever and oxygen requirement and rising CRP persisted. So we initiated methylprednisolone for 3 days, and then the patient improved, and finally we were able to stop his oxygen and discharge. So therefore, we need to at least spend a minute about corticosteroids in COVID-19 because we say that this is an inflammatory state and it might help. And there is some data about benefit of corticosteroids from China, Spain, and the US, and they are recommended in Chinese guidelines. But on the con side, they blunt the own immune system of the virus. They prolong shedding of the virus. They are not found useful in SARS, MERS, and influenza, and therefore most international guidelines don't recommend them. But in our unit, we have found them to be beneficial. So as part of our unit protocol, we start corticosteroids early in patients who are needing oxygen, give it for 3 to 14 days. And what we've realized is that the timing is important. If you use them early, they help. But by the time a patient is in frank ARDS and on the ventilator, nothing can actually save the patient. So to summarize, the bundle for managing admitting patients with mild symptoms, because some of them may need to be admitted to hospital just for isolation, or if they're healthcare workers, is basically to monitor them clinically, give them hydroxychloroquine, we are still doing it, and give paracetamol and other drugs for symptomatic relief and discharge them after 10 days of onset of symptoms. And if they deteriorate, then you manage them as moderate to severe COVID. And I would like to say that we've had 7-8 patients with comorbidities who started with mild symptoms and finally worsened on day 8 or day 9. And as far as bundle for managing moderate to severe COVID-19 is concerned, close monitoring, Especially, we ask them to walk and check their saturations because they may have normal saturations at rest, but it deteriorates after exercise. We do their lab tests, as I talked about earlier. We give them anticoagulation, paracetamol. Awake proning is very important in these patients because that improves their oxygenation. We try and delay intubation as much as possible and start them on methylprednisolone. And if they have high inflammatory markers and IL-6, we use tocilizumab. And as per now, we've had about 40 cases with severe disease, of which 20 have been discharged, 10 are still admitted, and 10 have died. So finally, I would like to end here by saying that it is a real challenge to manage COVID-19 because there are no specific drugs and the guidelines change every day. There is also the risk of transmission, fear, and social stigma. And in all this, we have to kind of manage the patient. But all I would like to say is that most of the people who get COVID actually do well. And our aim should be to try and focus on those with risk factors, monitor them very carefully, and once they deteriorate, refer them to a good critical care unit because they need excellent critical care. And you really don't need to test swabs again to document negativity. And as for now, you can tell patients who have recovered from COVID-19 that largely they are protected against a reinfection for the next 3 to 6 months. I think with that, I would like to end. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Singhal, for that informative presentation. Before we start the Q&A, I have a small announcement to make. We will be collecting the details of the attendees for the certificate. If you look to the chat box, you will notice a link that has been posted on the sticky message on top of your chat box. Please click this link and enter your details exactly how we want it on the certificate. Once you've entered the certificate and submitted the form, you will receive a certificate of attendance in your email inbox within 7 working days. Also, please note that a poll is being made live. Kindly rate our webinar in terms of content between 1 to 10, with 10 being the highest score. We will now move on to the Q&A session. So phenomenal presentation to both speakers who spoken very well. We've had a torrent of questions. So I'll be moderating those questions. The first question to Dr. Gokte. There are a lot of queries about zinc and vitamin C, especially oral zinc and mega doses of vitamin C, some of which Dr. Tanu has also covered. One query is these and other alternative herbal remedies are also recommended to improve immunity or boost immunity. Vitamin D is also in the same bracket. When many patients are actually dying of cytokine storms, which can be classified as a immune over response or immune overreach, does this make any sense? Do these drugs actually have any effect at all? Sir, you're muted. Please unmute yourself.
As far as immune boosters are concerned, in the scenario of severely ill patients, I think it's unlikely that any of them would really help. There you actually have an immune overactivity that's ongoing, and you want to suppress the overactivity of the immune system with the help of either corticosteroids or probably more specific drugs like anti-IL-6. So I don't really see the role of immune boosters there in those with more severe disease. But I think what Dr. Tanu did mention about zinc, and zinc is an interesting molecule because it's been shown to have some effect on viral infections and not just on in general, but in general, rhinoviruses. Zinc is also available for the treatment of diarrhea in kids. So zinc has a quite an interesting thing. But it's also important to remember that giving too much of zinc beyond a certain dosage can actually be harmful. And in the US, there were nasal preparations of zinc available for the treatment of viruses. And occasionally people have had an abnormal sense of smell or even lost the sense of smell. So you have to be careful when you're using zinc. And the hypothesis for COVID is that it actually increases the entry of hydroxychloroquine into the cell. So people believe that if you give zinc along with hydroxychloroquine, the effect of hydroxychloroquine may actually improve. So there is no harm done with zinc as long as you use a modest dose. But whether it will actually contribute to efficacy, hard to say right now. And I would say the same with vitamin D, which Dr. Tanu has already covered.
Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Tanu, another question that's in the same vein is, on a patient who is already on immunosuppressants due to whatever reason, should the dosage be changed if they are detected to be COVID-19, or should they be still given the same immunosuppressant dose?
So actually, it also depends on whether the detection of COVID-19 is a throat swab with no COVID symptoms, because that's what's happening. Many patients with cancer who are going for chemotherapy, they are being swabbed and they found to be COVID positive. So it really depends on that. So if the person is just the throat swab positive but no clinical symptoms of COVID, then you would continue the same immunosuppression. But if the patient is actually having COVID-19 disease, then I think in the initial part, I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but I would suggest that they would like kind of go slow on the immunosuppression. In this, I would just like to mention that we had one lady admitted with ITP, and she, as policy, she was tested for COVID and it came positive, but she had no symptoms of COVID whatsoever. So we went ahead and gave her pulse methylprednisolone and other treatment which we would have given for ITP anyways.
Thank you, Dr. Gatano. One query is hydroxychloroquine to Dr. Gupta. Is hydroxychloroquine safe to be given as a prophylaxis in close contacts to a person to a woman who's pregnant? Because there is a lot of controversy regarding this.
Yeah, so I'm going to defer that question also to Tanu if she has, but in general, anti-malarials have been used in pregnancy safely, but I would be very careful. Do we really need to use hydroxychloroquine? Do we really have enough evidence on the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine as a prophylaxis? And I think my opinion would be I would be very, very careful in using anything in a pregnant woman. I don't know, Tanu, if you've got another view on this.
So I agree completely with that. We are still not sure whether it works. So I mean, it would be okay to give it in a healthy person with a normal heart, but I mean, to give this in pregnant women or elderly would be difficult. However, if there is evidence which comes in that hydroxychloroquine is an effective prophylactic drug, then I think we could give it to pregnant women because actually it is safe in pregnancy, provided it really works.
Thank you. This question is to Dr. Tanu. There have been a lot of reports recently about the new multi-system inflammatory syndrome being seen in children. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit? And are there any premonitory symptoms or any tests that we can do to predict it or at least catch it in the early stages?
So the first thing I would like to say is that it is actually a very rare phenomena. So COVID-19 by and large in children is a very mild illness. These cases of multi-system inflammatory syndrome have been just a handful, maybe around 10 to 15 in Italy, some in the UK, some in the US, and about 3 to 4 in India. So first of all, I wouldn't like people to really panic, So if the child gets COVID, most likely 99.9% that child will do well. Yes, but there are some people who have this presentation, especially children between the ages of 5 to 14 years who have a Kawasaki-like presentation with high fever, redness of the eyes, they have cracked lips, they have a rash, and they have high fever, and some of them may come in shock, etc., etc. So these are the kind of people who again have a kind of cytokine storm, and they have to be managed, mainly with immunomodulatory drugs like tocilizumab, intravenous immunoglobulin, and corticosteroids. But I mean, if a child with COVID continues to run high fever beyond 3 to 4 days and his inflammatory markers are high, then and some of these clinical manifestations are present, then I would, be watchful.
Thank you, Dr. Tanu. Dr. Gupte, there is another query about about the usage of ivermectin, doxycycline, or even oseltamivir in COVID-19. Do you recommend any of these to be started? Because there is some news that these may be put into practice by now.
So I think, again, I read this newspaper article that a Bangladesh group has found efficacy of doxycycline plus ivermectin. But, I would be careful of just looking at press releases. Let's look at the study as and when it is published carefully. As far as oseltamivir is concerned, I think people in the early part did use oseltamivir, but at that time they weren't sure whether it was influenza or whether it was COVID. And they often give them a cocktail of lopinavir, ritonavir. I remember they gave oseltamivir and even ribavirin. So unsure of what it was. If you are sure it is COVID-19, oseltamivir really has no role to play in that.
And may I add one point here? We have observed that earlier in the epidemic, we were testing people with COVID even for co-infection with flu. So we were doing this, but we found no cases of flu at all. So it means that the flu activity currently has disappeared completely. So again, there is no rationale of giving oseltamivir right now, even if you have not tested patients for flu.
That actually leads into to another question that people have asked, that with the coming monsoon and the appearance of seasonal flu, how should their algorithm of seeing patients in the general practice be? Should they suspect? What should the testing be? What should they be doing? Are there any tips you can give them?
So basically, we don't know what is going to happen. We don't know when will seasonal influenza set in and whether it will set in, because normally, one virus predominates and kinds of other viruses don't. So I think what will happen is that if you start seeing a different pattern of illness, and if people start doing flu testing and start picking up cases, then it will be a problem, because then you'll have to really figure out whether a patient who's coming with fever is having either COVID, is having flu, and then the dengue, malaria, leptospira season will all start. So it will become more complicated, I guess, as time goes by. But I think we'll only know as when time comes, what is going to happen.
Sure. This question is also again to Dr. Tanu. There has been a lot of talk about how COVID manifests in an active symptomatic patient. A couple of people want to know, are there any symptoms or any particular features you see after the patient is discharged, after they become asymptomatic? Are there any post-viral symptoms that they see?
Yes, we often see. So we see a lot of body ache and myalgia, and some people, the sense of smell and taste doesn't return for even 2 weeks. That is something which we see. And third is we see a lot of psychological problems in these patients, because they continue to feel unwell. They continue to have sore throat. They don't really believe that they've recovered from COVID, especially if you've not done a swab to document negativity. And no amount of convincing can help them. So these are the kind of symptoms we continue to see.
Thank you. And our time is almost up. So I'm going to our last question. This question is to both the speakers. Over the past 3-4 months, we've amassed quite a bit of knowledge about the pathophysiology of this condition. We know how it manifests in the body, what happens, what receptor, how it goes through. We've also identified areas of intervention for drugs. And we've also identified most of the syndromes that happen. Despite this, what do you think is the cause for death, this high death rate that is seen in many countries, and also in patients who have relatively few comorbidities? So I'd like to address this question to both the speakers. Dr. Gokte, if you can go first.
So I think first is the high death rate is probably not the correct thing, because if you look at today, the death rate in India, which is talked about, is 3.5 to 4%. This is actually a proportion of the patients who have been diagnosed. And given the fact that a lot of COVID is probably asymptomatic, or you have very mild symptoms which you're not even picking up, people have postulated that the actual death rate may be less than 1, maybe as low as 0.5% of those who were infected. But other than that, it is still about 5 times the death rate that we see with flu. And that may well be many reasons. The pro-thrombotic state, which seemed unusual, which Tanu mentioned, it could be that people come in late. And I've often read people coming late to the hospital and dropping dead within 48 hours of reaching the hospital. There are people who have this immunological overactivity. I don't know if we can predict who will develop this immunological overactivity. Are we able to, should we monitor them early on for these inflammatory markers? So there are probably some unusual manifestations that have been seen with COVID. I've also read, I don't know if India it has been reported, but I've also read of several young people with strokes who have had, who have been related probably as a reason of COVID-19. So there are some very unusual reasons probably which we are still not fully understood. And maybe Tanu as a clinician will be able to explain more. Thanks.
No, so I must say that it is a very devious virus, unlike what we have ever seen in the past, because it does so many things to people, manifesting in different ways, affecting different organs, GI and neurology. It's really devious, and it is transmissible, and it is virulent. So that combination is difficult to come by. But said and done, most people actually die because of respiratory problems, and it is basically a combination of alveolar damage, which happens, and also microvascular thrombi in the pulmonary circulation. And that leads to VQ mismatch and hypoxic failure. That's the commonest cause of death.
That's all the time we have for now. I'd like to thank our speakers, and let me say the response on the chat has been overwhelmingly positive. Both your presentations were phenomenal. I'd also like to thank the attendees for joining us today and for their interesting questions. We will email you a link to the recording of this webinar within 24 to 48 hours. You will be able to watch the webinar at your convenience. Please feel free to forward the link to your colleagues who may have missed today's sessions. So before we sign off, I'd also like to give out the news that this is still a pandemic. Everybody, please stay safe, even though the lockdown has been relaxed. And also to our brethren in West Bengal and Orissa, we've heard that the cyclone has made landfall. We have a couple of attendees who are from there who say that they're facing 80-mile-per-hour winds and torrential rainfall. So I'd advise everybody, anywhere and everywhere, stay safe. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you, Vineet. Bye.
Thank you.